As we said, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our webinar attendees. We were just admiring the different locations that have tuned into this Vantage webinar today. So thank you very much for giving us some of your time today. We know that so much of you are on Zoom or other types of video calls all day, so we do appreciate that. My name is John Clemay. I'm the Director of Strategy and Growth at Institute for the Future. And essentially my role is to work with organizations to become future ready. We do that in a handful of ways, from training to advisory services, and to, most importantly, our Vantage program, which is what we're going to talk about today. Vantage is our foundational program that not only houses all of our current and past research, it also contains our signals scanning database, which is called Future Factors, which my colleague will share with you here in a minute. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before I hand it over to Dylan. Yes, please introduce yourself and where you're from in the chat. We will be sending a follow-up email to all of you that will include the video, so please share this with your colleagues, coworkers, because many of you are with organizations that are considering joining Vantage. We hope that you do. And let's see, we'll send the email, and also I referenced briefly our training and advisory services. There'll also be webinars talking about those two programs coming up later this month and one in early April. We'll share all of this in the follow-up email, but without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic to Dylan Hendricks, who manages our Vantage program, and he is the mastermind behind it, as well as Future Factors. So thank you again for joining. Dylan, take it away.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So nice to see so many people from all around the world. It's a privilege to be in front of such an international group here today, this morning. For me, I'm in Austin, Texas here. So as John mentioned, the Vantage partnership is the foundational research program at the Institute for the Future. There have been iterations of this program for several decades. This is where the longest running foresight organization that we are aware of. And as many of you probably know, the Institute for the Future, we are a nonprofit. We spun out of the RAND Corporation in the 1960s with a lot of the early internet pioneers who are working on the original hardware of the internet, including packet switching, things like this, and envisioning what could the internet be used for. So a lot of our original forecasts were looking particularly at that, at electronic communications back in the 60s and spawning out from there. So that DNA has allowed us to continue for this long. And today we work with many of the world's leading organizations across many different sectors. We work with foundations, we work with governments, we work with pretty much everybody. And our goal, our mission, the reason why we're also a not-for-profit, is to have the mission of helping organizations think more systematically about the long-term future. That's really what it's about for us, is we recognize that so many of the challenges that face us today have to do with many of the incentives that incline us towards short-termism. And we believe very passionately and strongly that the future is decided by us and the actions that we make today, and that the future is not already written, but that we can use the tools of foresight and the methodologies of foresight in order to help identify and pursue our preferred futures, to identify the futures that we want to create and become agents of making the future ourselves. So at the Institute for the Future, there's different processes and programs that we have for that. As John mentioned, we have our Foresight Essentials training, which teaches these basic methodologies. But what we do at Vantage is we share both tools for organizations to be able to build their own foresight capacity. So if you're an organization or community trying to build a foresight team, we have a lot of work that we put towards that, and then supporting those teams with the kinds of tools, content, and processes that can help them be successful and help them spread that foresight literacy across the entire organization, which is just so essential for success. So I'm going to show you these platforms that are in service of that, but this is really a part of a large ecosystem of services that we offer to our partners, including Foresight Guides, to help you to become more successful in your organization in the foresight practices that you do. So this comes down to things like our map of the decade, right? So there's content we produce every year. This is last year's map. We're currently working on the 2021 map, which is looking at climate positive organizations. And we had an event in just last month looking at that. This last year in 2020, we looked at organizing for future readiness. How do organizations become future ready? And our map of the decade was focused on the science and technology innovations that are going to help us do that. And you can see on Vantage Point for all of our partners, we have materials that dive into the core research every year and then deep dive into things like energy, material science. We're always trying to find ways to ensure that we provide a broad base of research and foresight for all of our different partners across all of these different verticals and sectors. So you can see when you go into something like this, you can go into the content, you can download the content. We try to produce everything in ways that can be leveraged by our partners within their organizations. So we deliver in PowerPoint, we deliver in PDF, we deliver in ways that you can bring this insight in and spread it, right? Often we know that the folks we're working with are kind of swimming upstream in their own organizations, trying to help tell the story of foresight and its value. And so we want to provide content that helps you to do that. That's really, as I said, our mission. We have a playbook that we produced last year as well, the playbook for building foresight capacity that gets into why to do strategic foresight. What are some of the best practices? We worked with a lot of our partners, a lot of other foresight practitioners last year to understand what are the ways that they overcome common challenges. So there's just a wealth of content in here. I won't pretend to generalize about it. You can see there's a lot in here within our library. You can go back years to content that deep dives into looking at the next generation, looking at post-pandemic futures, just a wealth of our research content that we make available for our partners as soon as it's ready here, and often exclusively to help them figure out how to use it. Coming up in May, we're hosting an event as we're going to launch this year's Climate Positive Organizations Map of the Decade, where we're going to be workshopping directly with our many partners to get the most out of that research and those tools to think about building backcasting exercises. What do you need to do today to what kind of a future do you want to work towards? And we also use Vantage Point for that purpose. So you can see in this event that we had just last month, we actually host these events on Vantage Point as well. And so you can go in after the event or during. This happens live while the events are happening. You can use the chat. You can meet with and talk with other partners about these events, and then go back and watch all of the materials and the videos that we produce for those as well. So that's Vantage Point. Vantage Point is our research hub. It is our community hub for our events. And you can see even things like coming up just next week, we're going to be having several events with our partners. We have a Foresight Talks on the capacity to decolonize. We have a Future Ready Organizations meetup. So this is getting our partners to learn from their peers across different organizations, meeting up, talking through, again, what their common challenges are, where they get the most value out of foresight in their organization. We know that sharing is so important, and that community building of working with other foresight groups and learning their best practices. And that's really what we're trying to build over time. So we have a lot of momentum towards that, and we're really eager to keep building that capacity. So that's Vantage Point in a nutshell. The other piece that I want to share with you, this is the piece that many of you maybe are here to see as well. This is Future Factors, which is sort of the sister platform from Vantage Point. It's accessible. It's the same login account. So we try to make everything as seamless as possible for our partners. This is our proprietary signal scanning platform. This is a project that started about 5 years ago internally, where when I first came to the Institute for the Future about 10 years ago, recognizing that there were many different ways in which people were scanning for signals. There was a strong culture in terms of the methodology of scanning for signals across our different research groups. And that really is the basis of so much value out of foresight, is having good signals from different disciplines across many different domains. So having people who are deep diving on the future of health, or the future of food, or the future of governance, the future of technology, bringing these interdisciplinary connections together, seeing the innovations that are emerging on the ground, and connecting those dots to identify those patterns. That's really where so much of the secret sauce of foresight comes from. And when I first came into the Institute, everybody had different ways and processes for sharing signals, and it was all relatively inefficient, right? There were some that were easy to share. You can share them in an email, but then if you want to go back 6 months later because you're working on a project and you're thinking, what's that signal, right? These kinds of issues were coming up. So we wanted to create a platform that was just optimized entirely for sharing and synthesizing signals with a community. So this began as an internal skunkworks project about 5 years ago. We launched it as a partner-facing service last year, right as the pandemic was hitting. And you can see we have thousands of signals on here, and we have signals added every day. This provides both a kind of a behind-the-scenes look at the research at the Institute for the Future itself. All of our researchers, as you can see, are posting signals every single day. And then many of our partners are using this as well, increasingly for their own signal scanning internally. So we created this both to be able to pull in signals from across all of our different groups, share them really easily, but also to be able to have that kind of private sharing to really incentivize that continuous sort of signal scanning practice that's so essential for building that foresight mindset, getting people in the habit of sharing signals. Now, we know that there are several different kinds of signal scanning platforms out there. One of the things that we think really distinguishes ours is just how easy it is to use. That was one of the main priorities, was knowing that if there's any friction in when you're reading a study, reading an article, and trying to share it with others, then people just aren't going to do it. And many of the signal scanning platforms out there seem to be kind of built on spec, right, by people who don't necessarily need to use them. And so you have these kind of onerous forms, or you're not even invited to contribute signals yourself. One of the things that we really realized was that for signals to have value in a culture and in a community, you need to have lots of people sharing them with each other. They're only as valuable as the people you're sharing them with. And so we created a system where if you are reading something, right, so I'll just go to something very easy here on the front page of the New York Times. This is not often where a signal would come from, but just for the example, say you're reading a article like this and you see something within it that has a potential that suggests a different behavior for the future, a different capacity, maybe a different policy in the future, these kinds of things that trigger us to think, oh, this is something interesting. All you have to do is we have this bookmarklet that is included in the browser that you can just install very easily. You hit that and it pulls all of the relevant information about that article out. And all you have to do is write a short headline about what you think, sort of communicating to other people who are going to look at the signal, sort of what is it, give them that basic sort of what so they can identify it, but then also sort of rewriting a headline that suggests the future possibility that you see within it. That's so what does this mean? So write a pithy headline, because this isn't a signal I'm actually choosing. I'm just going to give you the example, and then have a few tags, right? And we have a robust tagging system on the back end that can be used to help identify signals for other people to find. I can talk more about that tagging system, but it's not simply just tags. There's also tags that associate with each other in various ways, so that you can be sure that if you tag something with VR, that it will also be correlated with signals that are tagged with virtual reality or XR or other related things, right? So that tagging system is designed to make sure that you can capture the signals you're looking for in a search. All you do is you add those two things, and you hit add signal and it pops right up on here, right? So just takes a few extra seconds. And this is a way in which you can really start to develop foresight as a regular habit within your teams. You might have folks that are interested in foresight, that are champions of it, but that don't necessarily have the time to devote. But if you can get people to just spend a few minutes every morning when they're reading the news anyway, drinking their coffee, when they see something that they think is interesting and they want to share, be able to do it right then when they're thinking about it, spend 20 seconds sharing that. And then you can create events around those signals in order to process them together and start climbing up that foresight pyramid. I mentioned earlier that we have also created as of December of this last year and really January of this year, just a couple months ago, we launched our new boards feature. And I want to share that as well. So boards is a space within Future Factors that is private. It's more like Google Docs. It's sort of more of a functional workspace for you to be able to share signals just with folks that you want to. So we've been using this for public signal sprint campaigns. We just had an event yesterday looking at our first signal sprint campaign for this year's Map of the Decade on climate and finance signals. And you can see we ran this for just over a couple of weeks. We got 50 powerful signals about climate and finance from our staff, from across our foresight community, pulling those all together to look at what are the emerging innovations and policies and other signals that are happening in that landscape that can help us to forecast about where this is going and what kinds of scenarios we might anticipate for the future. The way that boards work is you can invite as many folks to them as you want. You can see you can set up a board very easily. You can determine whether it's just for everybody in your organization. We're creating public campaigns right now to show this feature and to catalyze our community around urgent futures. But we have, as I said, many world-leading organizations that are starting to use this for their own foresight capacity, really starting to spread this to large teams, get them to contribute signals privately with each other, use all of the kinds of things you would expect from a Reddit or a Pinterest to be able to comment, to be able to have chats, to be able to contribute those together. And the really cool thing about boards is when you set up a board with certain kinds of tags, then you have full control about what's on that board, but you can also look to see what signals are appearing in the public feeds, in our public community boards that you might want to pull in to those boards. And again, very easy to go in and add a signal to a board that you belong to that's on the public feed. And then once those signals are in there, you can export them, you can chat about them. As I said, all very optimized for building that signal scanning community. So I know it's a quick whirlwind. I went very quickly through a lot of features there, but I just want to pause there and invite John back up and see if we have any questions or happy to talk through how we use this, how different organizations use this, any questions you might have about the different services that we offer here.
Sure. Thanks, Dylan. I'll just read off a few from the chat. Mark asked, what about building the organizational sense that collecting and sharing signals is a value add activity? And can you share any best practices for that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question because it really is one of the most common sort of difficulties that organizations have out the gate trying to do foresight. It's so common that we see a large company or organization everybody sees the value sort of at one level or another of pursuing foresight these days, right? Because we all recognize that the assumptions we have of what our business opportunities are going to be going into the future are likely to be disrupted. And so they'll maybe spin up a team that's sort of siloed in one corner of the organization, doesn't have a lot of opportunities to communicate out. And that's often a good way for a foresight effort to sort of wither and die when it's not connected to the organization. And unfortunately, it doesn't matter in some ways how good those folks are. You might have brilliant folks, and often organizations do, looking at foresight. But if you can't crack into the culture of the organization, then it's not necessarily going to penetrate further. That's something that we have really focused on the last few years. So that's, as I mentioned, that playbook for future readiness that we produced last year, that is an ongoing piece for us. That is full of advice on that, and including how other organizations look at that. So you can use that for comparison. You can use that to make arguments internally to say, look, if this is going to be effective, this is how what we need to do. We provide different tools that we've created for thinking about different kinds of foresight teams and what's appropriate for different kinds of communities and organizations. And we provide a lot of ideas of processes and activities that we recommend groups do together. And some of that comes out in terms of the straight methodologies of it in our foresight training. So often, just to give an example of how we help organizations through that, often what we'll recommend is that when folks first come in, if they don't have a lot of formal foresight history, or even if they do and they're looking for something more effective, then we'll often suggest that they have a team that takes that basic foresight training, takes those courses, which are all also remote. They'll be available in person again, pandemic allowing, in the fall. And just sort of ground a group of people in those literacies and that 50 years of methodologies and frameworks that we have to offer, that we've seen return on those frameworks, the ones that have really lasted through that much time. So ground folks in those core literacies, and then have practices and this is where Vantage often comes in, to engage those groups in foresight in an incremental basis to help them build towards being future ready. One of the things that we very often suggest, and that we see, this is where you get huge kind of immediate gains in engagement, is by engaging the organization in signal scanning as a regular practice. And so often what we'll do is we'll host a workshop with groups where we'll bring signals in, we'll have that as pre-work, we'll help facilitate it with different groups in the org, get on the attention and the radar of more folks. Often within that, you can identify the kinds of folks across different divisions who maybe don't work in foresight at all, who are going to be champions for this work. And we help identify the different kinds of roles that can exist within that. So some people are going to be thinking about foresight in a lot of their day. Other people are just going to be in a position of maybe being a decision maker, a connector to a decision maker who can help speak the language of foresight and be a champion of that work that's coming out of those foresight teams, bringing it up to the C-suite, bringing it up into those decision-making meetings. And then we also provide all of these different tools and processes to say, okay, so you've got this one event, there's momentum going, often there's a lot of energy after an initial event. How do we keep this going? How does this not burn out? And that's where we really advise things like a signal scan club, right? Something where you maybe have some light incentives in the first time that you're doing it to, whoever has the best signals as voted on by the group wins some kind of prize, something that gets people over that initial difficulty of doing something new, something that's outside of their main work stream. But the thing about foresight and signal scanning is that it's kind of addictive. Once you start to do it a little bit more, then it becomes easier to do the next time. And then your brain starts automatically making those shortcuts, right? It's like anything. The more you practice it, the more natural it becomes. And once you get people in the habit of sharing signals on a regular basis, then they're doing it all the time. One of the things that we've really found that's really interesting about Future Factors is that it seems to be easy enough for people to use that the folks that use it all the time. That we see that the most regular signal scanners are people that are in there every single day, and folks are doing that within their own organizations. So we don't see that always in the public feed because sometimes they want to share those signals in the context of internal projects that are not public, right? Obviously, there's a lot of IP and work that people are doing that they want to keep more private. So we facilitate that use case. But we also think there's just a ton of value in this public feed of being able to have something that is a social network, essentially, that is optimized for thinking about the future, right? There's not a lot of doomerism, not a lot of sort of distractions, but really just what's going on in ways that are going to point us towards futures and help us think about what these new things mean, what's something that might otherwise feel like a disruption or a distraction. What does it mean for the ways that our audiences, our markets, our customers are potentially changing, what we're going to need to think about for work practices, what we're going to need to think about in terms of what technology offers, what our competitors are doing, right? So I hope that starts to answer that question, but to say that it's a very common challenge, and we have a lot of processes and practices designed very specifically to help organizations build that literacy and the habit within their groups.
Great, thanks, Dylan. Another question that I've received in a few different forms is essentially asking, how do other partner organizations connect with each other and learn from each other, and just talk about the community of Vantage members?
Yeah, absolutely. So we recognize that this is, in some ways, one of the most important things that we can help facilitate and provide is getting people to connect with each other. This is something that we're still trying to figure out the best practices for. So we're offering a lot of different ways to do this, and to say we're still building on how to do that. So this is something that we have as a key driver of our own, where we want to take the program. So some of it comes from these meetups, right? So we want to try to create as many opportunities as we can to have these kinds of meetups and to facilitate the opportunity for groups to work together. So the way that Vantage Point and Future Factors are designed is that for people that discover each other at one of our events, right? Our 10-year forecast event we put on every year is probably the main way that people have traditionally done this. This was up until the pandemic. Always a very big immersive multi-day event. It'll return to being that in the future. It was still that way, but just hosted remotely this last year. So we have foresight practitioners from across really every sector, every kind of organization, hundreds of folks that are working in foresight every day that come to our events. And that meet each other, right? We know that one of the main reasons they come is to meet each other. One of the main things that we want to provide is opportunities for them to build on those relationships going forward. So, for example, different Vantage partners from different orgs, if they know about each other, they can find each other and build boards for maybe cross-organizational collaboration, right? Maybe there's areas that are non-competitive of interest that you want to build on. You can do that in the main feed of Future Factors, of interacting with other folks and uploading their signals. Or you can also do that in terms of building private boards. We want to create more of these kinds of meetups as a part of our calendar of events and services. And we have other features that are sort of ready to go. We have a groups feature for Vantage Point that we are still really just also looking for what is the best opportunity to pull people together. And I think some of this, to be frank, is that we wanted, because we know everybody's working remotely during the pandemic, that people's time and attention is very fragmented and very torn in different directions. So we've been trying to figure out both how to address this need in general, but how to address it in the pandemic, right? So that's where we are still, as futurists, also trying to see where is this going? What's the need going to be post-pandemic, and how do we move towards that? But as I said, we have a big base of those things, and we do recognize that one of the best things we can offer to our network is the awareness of who else is in that network. We have many of the big automotive companies, we have manufacturing companies, packaged goods. We cover so many different kinds of sectors with the folks that come into IFTF looking for support in their foresight teams and building their future readiness. And so that's something that we're also continually looking for more opportunities, as I say, to build on.
Great, thanks, Dylan. One of the great things about these Vantage webinars is some of the questions that come up that make us think, and oh, that would be a cool thing. But Maricel asked, does the tool suggest new signals on the topic we might be searching, or do you only get the chance to add signals to future factors?
No, absolutely. So yes, absolutely. There's, because of the way that things are tagged, you can search for something that you might be interested in, and you'll get back a lot of the signals that are coming out that are from our staff and from across our partner organizations that are looking at that. We also increasingly have boards that are being created that are being used specifically for that. So this is a board created recently on virtual gathering signals, looking specifically just at signals that are around what are different ways to use XR and emerging media to gather together, and signals based on that. But because, as I say, because of the tagging system, you can sort of think about it kind of any topic you want and pull up the signals that are going to be relevant for that. More signals being added all the time in terms of how to use those things. So that's a huge goal of future factors. And one of the things that we really think can be helpful for projects as well, if you are starting a project on, say, AI and food growing, or on urban development and on something else, that you can create a board around that, pull in all of the relevant signals that we already have gathered as a community around that, and get a huge jump start on that horizon scanning activity that you're trying to do yourself. So we want to really make also tools to facilitate the kinds of foresight practices that we're training people on, and make it really easy to use those tools so that you get sort of a head start on not having to start from nothing when you're doing that, and being able to pull these different kinds of signals in and get started right away on the kind of foresight activities that you might be pursuing.
Got it. Thanks, Dylan. Another good question from John. He just asked, Dylan, do you see this as a learning and development function of large organizations? It may be hard to enter into very established companies. So what's the best point of entry for folks that want their organization to become Vantage members? That's a good question. We have folks coming from all different kinds of groups, and we have materials that meet different needs. I think some of the main areas where we see groups coming from are, maybe consumer insights. We see it coming in from R&D. We see groups coming in from like product innovation. Every organization and sector sort of holds itself differently in that way. Sometimes they're just a bespoke foresight unit that are within the organization. One of the things that I will say is the most successful is the more buy-in that you have from decision makers within the organization, the more successful these things will be. So often I think one of the most successful ways for foresight to work in an organization is to have a kind of a pilot project. So a lot of the ways that we first work with groups is that we will produce something like a custom forecast, which is something that we work with a lot of organizations on, taking our foundational research, tailoring it for that organization, that sector, and often trying to produce it for the CEO or the C-suite in some capacity, something that is a strategic document that is an outside-in look at what are the future opportunities, maybe outside of the radar of that team and that strategic team, looking 10 years out, and what needs to happen today in order to mitigate those risks or take advantage of those opportunities. And once there is sort of there's always this kind of moment in projects like that where there is an aha moment where folks who are within the organization view what they do differently because of where they see the signals of where that broader industry might be going, or
where adjacent industries might intersect or converge with their primary activities in the future. And that kind of aha moment often then drives sort of a larger foresight movement within the organization. But it's really different for everybody. You know, it's something we're happy to have conversations about one-on-one to understand the sort of shape of your organization and where you're looking at bringing this in. I think it can certainly be a learning and development thing, but there's a danger there of it feeling not actionable, right? And so sometimes those don't last as long. So you really want to tie it in some way to a strategic effort. To, you know, sometimes it's the HR team, right? There's all different kinds of microcosms within an organization that can really take advantage of foresight. But the more that the entire organization has its eyes on the future, then the more flexible and resilient it's going to be to future shocks. And that's where we think some of the most strategic value comes out for organizations. That's where you have an organization that will do a project with us, you know, like Mercedes is an example that we've been using recently. A recent project we did with them where they pursued different foresight activities that created an appetite for more. And as a result of the custom foresight work we did with them, they ended up moving their climate mitigation and adaptation plans up by 10 years. And they kind of created a new vision for themselves in terms of their hardware manufacturing as a result of looking at where the landscape seems to be going and where they are and relative to it. And that started with just a briefing from one of our researchers to a group of executives, sparked an aha moment, sparked a small project, became a big project. And now they're also building their own large foresight capacity within their teams in order to keep this work alive and growing, because they just see it as so vital to maintaining the relevance in a world that is, if you're just looking at what's right in front of you, is just immediately overwhelming, right? The sort of the disruptions we see to our assumptions from the last half century of how mainstream society works, right? These things, I think, require a larger appetite for looking at those signals in terms of, you know, our colleague Bob Johansen always says that it's kind of easier to get clarity when you're looking at something noisy in the present if you're looking at it from 10 years out than if you're trying to look at it from 2 quarters out, right? If you are trying to just see where is this going to go in 3 months or in a year, then that can be a kind of a crazy making exercise because things are swinging so wildly. But if you look out 10 years, that broader trend starts to reveal itself, and you can start to sort of grab a hold of, okay, what are the kinds of big decisions we need to make now that are going to help us survive this noisiness and get to where we want to go, a place that's viable and that's new and that we can attain over the next 5 to 10 years. And so that's one of the things we're always advising, is that way of thinking, that foresight mindset can be really transformative in at first subtle ways and then really dramatic ways within an organization.
Thanks, Dylan. Just one quick housekeeping note. We are at time, so if you do have to jump, do so. But there are so many good questions coming in. I certainly want to answer all of them, if not most of them, over the next few minutes. So we will stay on and answer these remaining few questions. And very quickly, Dylan had just mentioned how we do custom foresight work. I touched on this briefly at the beginning. That kind of falls into our advisory services bucket here at IFTF, and there will be an introduction to IFTF advisory services on March 25th. I'll put the events link in the chat box so you can see on March 25th we'll be taking a deeper dive around that types of work that we do within our advisory services. Okay, quick question from Mark. If you get lots and lots of people sending in signals, how do you separate the signal from the noise, Dylan?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that we're also, you know, as we scale up in the number of people that are contributing to it, we're going to scale up those features as well. A big part of what we have as an advantage, I think, right now is that because we have a community of people that are foresight practitioners, right? This isn't open broadly to the public. So we don't have like YouTube problems in terms of creating a blank space on the internet and then people kind of projecting what's going on in their head onto it. These are folks that are really focused on this. And I think that really are grateful to have a space to do this kind of work. And often the folks that are coming onto here are coming out of some kind of a foresight program where they've been trained on signals in some way. It can be that can be very short, right? Just I think within an hour. We're actually looking right now at ramping up a foresight training kind of fast futures course that can cover things like signals in just 90 minutes for a team. Once you have that kind of methodology down, once you have people working in good faith on this, because there isn't a lot of incentive to do it if you're not, then the quality is pretty high. But I think it's a very fair question, because especially as you have new teams coming onto it, you're going to have different kinds of folks with different kinds of literacies and focus on there. And that's where we think the boards are really super helpful for that. So that's a place where, coming back into this board, one of the things with the boards is that you can have sort of admin roles on the board, the hosts of the board, and they have full curatorial power. And so one of the ways that you can separate the signal from the noise is you have just, and this is what we did on our public sprints and how we manage this problem for ourselves, is that we have a lot of signals that could go on the board, right? So when people are submitting signals to potentially suggest, those all appear in here. This is sort of the long feed. And then we reserve the power to add those signals officially to the board to the folks who have that power. So some people might have read-only access, some people might be able to suggest, other people can curate. And so by having that, maintaining that curatorial power with your Foresight champions who are the most focused on what's going to be relevant, then you can really sort of ensure more of that quality. You can also use these boards to have discussions to build that kind of awareness with your team. So one of the things within the chat is you can actually drag a signal into the chat and say, hey, I love this signal, and share it directly and use this as kind of an asynchronous tool to be able to share with the folks that you are sharing signals with, like what are examples of a good signal, and by having small meetings, sometimes we often advise meeting maybe once a quarter, right? So you have people submitting signals, but maybe when you're more active, it's once a month, but once a quarter is often sort of a good cadence right away to have a lot of people submitting signals over time, have a meeting with that larger group of people, invite some decision makers to it, have a meeting of sort of a signal scan club where you go through, curate what you think the best signals are, and then talk about why those were the best signals. What were the signals that really stood out? And use that as a kind of a teaching moment for everybody who was involved to be able to say, oh, this is where the relevance was. These are the kinds of things I'm going to be thinking about in the next round of this. And as you go through multiple cycles of that, you're just going to find that the quality of the signal scanning goes up, the relevance to the organization goes up over time. And you can use these kinds of tools either in a meeting, like I say, where you use this to facilitate the meeting, or asynchronously to be able to sort of kind of nudge around, here's the kinds of signals that we really like. Here's one that we really want to call out, putting those comments in that, like I say, a lot of these signal platforms that are out there are designed just as sort of a top-down kind of like, here is what some experts have decided and let's bring them in. We believe much more that collective intelligence that can come out of growing a group's awareness of what they're looking for, reinforcing the right kinds of behaviors. That's how you build an organization that can actually not just sort of take in this material, but generate its own insights about itself that are looking further out and are not just reactionary, right? Which is where so many of us end up falling when we're just trying to survive the next quarter, survive the most recent disruption. A certain amount of that's kind of inevitable these days, but the more you can keep your eye on where are we trying to get to, having that, what our colleague Bob Johansson calls that clarity over that certainty, that's what the signal scanning is really there to help you do and to build over time. And as I say, we offer a lot of training, a lot of practices, foresight guiding. Almost everything we do over time is moving towards how do we help other folks to do this for themselves and for their organizations.
Great, thanks, Dylan. Had a question from Lisa. She asked if there were, or present or past, any academic institutions that were part of Vantage or working with IFTF. I can speak to that briefly. Southern New Hampshire University, you may have even seen some signals being added by our friends there. The Yuba Community College District here in Northern California, Roger Williams, Florida International, Portland State, University of Sydney, UC Davis. We've worked with UC San Francisco.
UC Long Beach.
UC Long Beach in various ways. So those are ones I can think of. And I know we've done work with Wake Forest and Notre Dame in the past as well. Anything else, Dylan, to add to that?
Well, it's that's a really good list, and I'm sure there's more, but one of the things that makes me think of is, as I say, so we're still in sort of the first year really of Future Factors. One of the things that I really have as a goal as we build out our community over the next few years as well is to have more partnerships with academic organizations as well. So in terms of bringing in students that are working on Foresight that are not quite businesses yet, or like how do we bring in folks that are trying to learn Foresight within their own academic programs. As you mentioned, I think Southern New Hampshire University has been very active on the boards here. and other folks like that. But it's really important, and certainly, as you say, like a big part of our audience and a big part of the projects that we work on.
Great. Iris asked, have you collected data on ROI of the use of these platforms to the bottom line in an effort to convince other managers to participate in the Vantage program?
We do not have that yet. We don't have the enough data history in order to be able to do that. That is something that we want to be able to provide as we have more of that data history, right? I think just within a year period, you can imagine it'd be hard to sort of generate that ROI, especially because 2020 was, I think when we go back and look at the history of everything, 2020 is always going to have an asterisk next to it and a list of things that were happening, just because almost everything was an outlier last year. But that is certainly something that the data that is coming in from the platforms can help us to do. And we have been partnering with other organizations to find ROI on other pieces of foresight. So the pieces that do have enough history, like the core practices, even having a foresight team, one of the things that we produced last year that was around our future ready organizations work was looking at, maybe it's not in this one, but looking at what are the best practices, what are the kinds of organizations that, and what are the kinds of foresight teams that those organizations and their managers report getting the most value out of, and why. So that was a study that we undertook with the Nuremberg Institute as a partner, and we're doing more work like that every year, really trying to build out more of that quant story, because we personally feel that almost everything that gets missed is something that just you can't put a number on, right? So much innovation gets lost in terms of what we can measure. And at the same time, also very cognizant that if you can measure something that is previously unmeasurable, that is just a huge lever for being able to act on it in the organization and make that cost benefit calculation. So that's something we're constantly working towards, but we also want to stay sort of active in the tension of recognizing that we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that it's only the things that we can directly measure that are important, because that's, as we all know, that's almost never the case, right? So a very known need, something we're working actively towards, and something that we also want to help organizations to get more comfort with some of those qualitative signals, especially when they're very strong.
Thanks, Dylan. One thing I thought I would be remiss if I didn't ask, can you give us any sneak peek into some tools or things that you want to add or plan to be adding to the Vantage platform in the future or near future?
Yeah, so obviously one of the main things is we're taking feedback all the time from our partners about their different use cases and how they're using the platforms, and building in functionality to make sure that they're getting the most out of it. So we want to be really responsive to our partners on that. We know this is becoming a core tool for many of them. And in addition to that, we're also, as I mentioned before, building out those community features. So we have a feature right now called groups that we can implement in Vantage Point. And we're just wanting to make sure we find exactly the right way to use it to facilitate more of those connections between partners. So those two things are the main things that we're really focused on, especially, as I said, the Sports feature is just a couple months old. So we haven't had a lot of bugs in it, but we want to be aware of that rollout period. As we look towards the future, there's nothing I can commit to on a date right now, but the roadmap is pretty long for what we want to do. And what we want to do is really move up that hierarchy of foresight activities. So once we have a robust signal scanning platform and people are collecting signals, we want to be able to create tools and workspaces to help people use those signals in other ways. So one really big obvious use case is steep mapping, and doing that kind of driver mapping of how do these signals collect into clusters of drivers that can influence a horizon scanning kind of project. Or as I say, steep, that's language might be familiar to quite a bit of you, of those are common drivers of looking at technology, science, environment, politics, things like that, and how those are pushing us towards certain directions in the future. And we also want to, continue to improve future factors in terms of the intelligence behind the scenes that it's using for the tagging, right? So can we use AI sentiment analysis to do auto tagging? That's a question we're very interested in over the next year, just to continue to make this easier to use and more powerful, those kinds of things. But for right now, we're really focused on making sure that for the use cases that it has, that it works as well as possible.
Got it. Thanks, Dylan. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody. I know we went a little bit over time today, but There were so many wonderful questions. If they didn't get answered, we will follow up with you individually to answer your questions. The whole group will get that follow-up email with all the content we discussed today, the video of this webinar. So if you missed something or if you had to step away, you can watch that video. A couple of things to note. I mentioned the advisory services introduction webinar is happening on March 25th. I shared the events link. And if you want to show some of your colleagues or coworkers more information on Vantage, please let me know or other members of our team. We can follow up, set up individual one-on-one demos. We are doing another one for Vantage on April 21st. This will be later in the day, so a little more friendly for our Asia Pacific folks. So that's happening then. Beyond that, thank you, Dylan, very much for walking us through the latest and greatest of the IFTF Vantage platform. A lot of thanks to you for that. And thank you again for giving us some of your time today to learn a little bit more about Vantage. We certainly hope that you want to join the Vantage community. So we'll follow up with you and talk about next steps with all of you. So with that, thank you and goodbye.